Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, we will introduce you to what we hope will be the first of many graduate student-led interviews. This episode will be hosted by Charlotte Howley, a PhD student in UCLA's Iranian Studies program. It has been a goal of ours to provide our graduate students with the opportunity to interview scholars they admire. In this episode, Charlotte speaks with Dr. Neville McFerrin, a professor of art history at the University of North Texas. They speak about the connections between dress, ornamentation, and architecture, particularly in the context of research on Pompeii and Persepolis, the concept of proprioception and how ancient peoples understood their environments and interactions within them, and the role of water and plant imagery in the art of Persepolis. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Charlotte Howley, and I'm a second-year graduate student in the Iranian Studies program at UCLA. And welcome to this first graduate student-led episode of the Legacies of Ancient Persia podcast. And I'm here today with Professor Neville McFerrin, the assistant professor at the Department of Art History at the University of North Texas. So I thought I'd open this interview with sort of a broad question. So what brought you to ancient studies more broadly, and specifically sort of ancient art history and dress studies? What got you into the field, so to speak?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm Neville, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you all, and I'm really happy to think about that question. Well, I think there's a multi-part answer here. Part one starts when I was very small. I was a voracious reader as a child, and one of those people that really always liked research. So I had a childhood membership to a museum near where I grew up in Nashville that was then called the Cumberland Science Museum. They changed the name now, and I don't know what they changed it to. But at the time, it was the Cumberland, and they had this child lecture series that you could sign up to go to if you were a member. And this was the highlight of my calendar. I picked out the ones I was going to do. And in conjunction with a dinosaur exhibition that involved animatronic dinosaurs, which was another big highlight, they had a paleontologist talk. And that, I think, was maybe one of the moments that material culture became really interesting. This idea that there was information just kind of in the ground and you could get it, and that all the things you could build from it. And I was lucky at the time that we had a lot of friends that thought along similar lines. So we had a friend named Morris Hale who had so much geological knowledge. And so we'd go on walks and talk about the rocks. And my mother had a set of friends that one of them was an antique dealer. And so the stories that you could build around things were really central to my life then. I didn't really know you could do anything with that, but I knew that museums were interesting, and I was thinking as I grew older, maybe I would work in one. And when I went to college, someone mentioned, well, if you want to do museums, you might look at classics. And I had very little idea about what that meant, but I was lucky because I was at Oberlin College. And at the time, Thomas van Noordwijk was offering a series of classes on the Iliad and Tragedy and the Odyssey and Comedy. So I signed up for the Iliad and Tragedy because I got really good advice from my first-year advisor. And I think from that moment, that was what I was going to work on. The intricacy of the text, the way that we call him TVN, the way that TVN brought it to life and showed us the way that the language came together. That was fascinating. And so I kind of jumped into that. I did Greek and Latin as an undergrad. And at the same time, I think that's really where Persia came from, because TVN had a very careful way of presenting Hector. And this idea of Hector as a figure who wasn't an antagonist, and the way that Homer is careful to balance the story. In TVN's class, that led directly into Aeschylus's Persians. and the question of how does this work for someone like Aeschylus, or does it? How much of that Homeric sensibility is maintained? That meant that really my first academic introduction to the Persians was a very careful one. And that really primed things for a moment that's where the dress comes in. It was my first year at Michigan as a graduate student, that is, and Margaret Coolroot gave a talk as part of a lecture series. Everything with me, I guess, comes to a lecture series, as part of a lecture series at the Kelsey Museum. And she was talking about dress. She was discussing the jewelry from Seleucia on the Tigris. And I had not ever really considered that as a topic, but I was fully aware of the power of dress because I was surrounded by people who were incredibly excellent dress practitioners. And so when I saw that that was a possibility, I think that's really the moment that I did what I do, and I started talking to people and reading things and didn't go back.
Wow, no, that's fabulous. I have to say, I think it's really nice that your introduction to Persia was so careful and so made such an attempt to be balanced, because I have to say that was really not my experience in sort of my classics course. Was very much a sort of straightforward traditional one. The Persians were.
You start with Herodotus.
Yeah, oh yes, we started with Herodotus, and not even a good way of approaching Herodotus. I remember once I was in a tutorial and I'd asked how you're supposed to say the name. It was like Artaphernes or Artaphrines, because Herodotus spells it differently. And I'd asked my professor, so how do you pronounce this then, given that there's two different ways? And his response, I remember, was, "Oh, it's Persian, who cares?"
Oh no.
Which sort of, yes, no. So I think that's really great that it was that you had such a much more balanced approach to Persia and sort of seeing it from their perspective.
I think, yeah, there's something that's sort of remarkable about coming at Persia from the side, as it were, that we did Herodotus second. Herodotus at Oberlin was the second year Greek, well, yeah, the second half of the second year Greek course. So you went from learning grammar to Homer to Herodotus. And this all happened kind of in parallel with courses in translation, which is where, Tibian really was bringing so much interesting stuff to us all. But there's something very interesting about getting Herodotus after you've seen these other ways of thinking about the system, that then you're ready to think, oh, that seems a bit off. And I think that it was helped too, the introduction to Herodotus, by the fact that we, as many people do, I think, started with the Egypt chapters. So, when you start with Egypt, you maybe are prepared to look at Herodotus and say, that sounds very strange. I'm not entirely certain that that's accurate. And that was a bit of a theme in the course that we read it's a favorite passage of mine. Herodotus he's so interesting around the Scythians, and this idea that what's happening with meteorological stuff in Scythia and the feathers that fall from the sky. Like, of course, yeah, that's snow, isn't it, Herodotus? And he's seen snow. You know that he's seen snow. There's snow on the top of mountains in Greece, but in the kind of service of presenting these territories is very different. He exaggerates things, which is the nicest way of putting it, I think. He exaggerates things. And so then when we did kind of turn our attention to the Persians, you're prepared for, there may be something in there that is in some way related to activities taking place in this territory, but the lens that it's coming through could be doing any number of things that have very little to do with Persia.
No, indeed. No, and I think it's a really good approach. Now, I'm sort of bringing together, I guess, two things that you brought up there. So both about the sort of the exaggeration of difference, and then also sort of bringing things back to dress and the relation of dress to sort of ornamentation and architecture and things. Obviously, quite a lot of your work outside of Persia is, and which I've really enjoyed reading, is on sort of the artistic programs of houses in Pompeii, and sort of how that forms a cohesive program with sort of reflection and dress and the presentation of people. And I was wondering, given that these are your two sort of areas, major areas of focus, how much similarity you found there between those different features, and sort of undercutting this whole east-west dichotomy that gets presented in the sources. So yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a wonderful thing to think about. When I started doing the kind of two halves of my research, it was because there was another person in the mix who is Elaine Gazda, who is just a sort of lion in the field of Roman art. And she is someone who thinks very intricately about programming. And that's kind of where my graduate work began to take shape. And I think that when I started doing these two things at once, my thought was, well, let's see if the ideas that are starting to coalesce around dress, which, if people aren't kind of aware of the term, is a great one. It takes into account a whole suite of body modifiers. So if it modifies the body, it's dress. It could be a hairstyle or shoes or scarification or the way you work out or your clothing. It's a really fantastic term. And we could talk about that for years probably. But yeah, so I started thinking about the fact that in Pompeii, at least, dress is central to the way in which people are depicted. And this shouldn't be a surprise to people who know their Cicero, because when Cicero wants to attack somebody, dress is often a central focus. Your cloak was too long. It was the wrong color. You were supposed to be showing yourself in this way, and you wore these fancy shoes. He's looking at you, Varys, and that this is all part of a world that says that the way that you present your body in public is a central component of the way that you interact with the people you encounter. And this is something that, when we talk about the paintings of Pompeii, is kind of interesting, because in many cases people had looked at this as sort of iconography, that if we see X person holding Y thing, then we know that they must be one of four people, and our goal is to look for more details that allow us to understand which of those four people is being depicted. And when I looked at it, this was another sort of beautiful thing that happened. In the Kelsey Museum, there are a series of near life-size paintings of Room 5 in the Villa of the Mysteries that were painted by Maria Barroso. And in those paintings, they're fascinating. They were done very shortly after the excavation of the room. And one of her goals was to maintain the color that she was looking at. And so before the cleaning of Room 5, they were a really great way of getting at detail. And one of the details that was very clear was the repetition of just a gigantic red ring. And so my question was, well, what is that? What is it doing? Why is it repeated? What's the story there? And well, I think it's a signet, and more on this, in other zones, I guess. But once I saw that, I thought, these details, they're giving us information, and we ought not overlook them. And I think that's really the connection that I saw initially between dress in Pompeii and dress in Persia. Look at the details. These are things that are not happenstance. You had to do extra work to get them onto the wall. And anytime anyone does extra work, in my mind, that's meaningful. That's where I started. I didn't think there was going to be much more overlap than that. But increasingly, what I do see is something that you alluded to, Charlotte, this idea that the interaction between space, people in the space, and what's happening on the wall is key to both zones. And I would hesitate to generalize any more than that. But one thing that I'm thinking about kind of seriously has to do with that definition of dress. What does modify the body? When we create an environment, when we build a space, is not the body central to that as well? Is it a response to the body schema? Does it enable it and extend it in a way that works similar to something like a prosthetic? If so, that opens up huge avenues for us to continue to make these kind of connections. I would say that they don't use space at Persepolis in the same way that they use space in Pompeii. Their goals are very, very different, but maybe a point of connection is the relationship between space and the body. And I would say that in both zones, bodies aren't people unless they're dressed. And that if space is a sort of body or a response to the body or an extension of the body, then it too needs to be dressed. And I think that kind of a concept lets us build, and I think does let us break down that dichotomy you were mentioning. It kind of helps us understand. There's a quote by Mortimer Wheeler that I think about a lot that has to do with the slavish repetition of figures at Persepolis. And it's really an encapsulation of that dichotomy you were talking about, that in one zone we have originality and new thought, and in another zone we have repetition of same. And there's a lot in that that has to do with the way that conceptualizations of art have been used to maintain difference. But one thing that I think looking at dress does, and thinking about buildings as correlates to bodies does, is it allows us to understand that variation happens in small doses, that the articulation of a curl that is different, that the fact that one figure has a different scabbard than another, this is really where we see the tension that is central to what's going on in Persepolis, certainly. And I think in Pompeii too, that it's hard to find a crowd scene where everyone is the same. And that is very similar in my mind to the wonderful wall of waiting Persians at the Apadana. Here's a crowd scene where no two figures are identical. And that does help us think about to what extent are the things that we hold as true about spaces like Persepolis just a perpetuation of something modern?
No, precisely. And I really like that you've brought that up. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. Obviously, very much outside the period we're talking about, that I've been doing for another research project that I'm working on at the moment. I've been doing a lot of stuff on the geometrical decorations of late Seljuk era tomb towers in Iran, where obviously completely irrelevant from what we're talking about, seemingly.
Oh, I don't think so. It doesn't sound like it is.
But the thing you were saying, that quote from Mortimer Wheeler, there is exactly the same with sort of Western art historical approaches towards these tomb towers, where there's almost word for word, there's like, yes, the slavish repetition of these geometrical forms, and yes, well, here's just another Quranic inscription. None of this is important at all, because it's not, this figural art which in the West gets prioritized so much. And I think, the big discoveries that we're making in that field now are that, as you say, all of these things are choices, and they're all so deliberate. And to say, it's slavish repetition, and it's just the same thing again and again, is just, it hides the hidden details, and really hides these deeper meanings that they're trying to convey, certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just, as you say, the imposition of modern categories on the ancient world. And we do need to think our way out of that, definitely.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge to think our way out of it, because in so many cases it's repeated. This truism is repeated so much that it's hard to understand where it came from, what it's based in, and how to untangle it. So it's a bit of an irony. They're complaining about repetition while repeating something that is doing the same, level of evening out. And I think that's a loss. It's a loss to lose all of these intricacies and all of the sort of messy parts of the systems that we encounter. That's where we see them. That's where we understand them best, maybe.
Definitely. And I really loved in some of your articles the way that you sort of you go into these details and sort of discuss how they draw the viewer in, sort of with the experience of jewelry as touch, and the fact that you can see those things, and the pots they're holding or the bracelets they wear, and these are things that you yourself would be wearing or interacting with, and that draws you into it. And the way that these details draw you in is really interesting.
Really deliberate, I think. At Persepolis in particular, they have such a challenge at Persepolis. And if you look at the fortification tablets, we know that there are all kinds of different people in and out of this space. And they have to come up with something that can talk to all of them. And they know that, do they have the same language? No. Do they have the same sort of, the art historian Anne Hollander would call them pictures, the repeated norms of visualization in a territory? Do they have the same pictures? No. But what they want to do at Persepolis is somehow communicate to this vast set of people who work very differently that they can come together as a functional whole. And I think that that sensorial interplay is how they do it. Well, you may not know what that other person is talking about. You may have never heard of the place that they aim from, although they probably have. It's an interconnected world. But what you do know is, what does it feel like to lead a sheep? And what does it feel like to wear a bracelet? These kinds of things are shared experience, and it's a starting point to build the system that is idealized in the space. Start with shared sensations and build out. And it's very useful for us because we're often wishing we had data from the Persians, the Achaemenids in particular, that we don't have. But, we do have those sensations. They haven't changed all that much. And so that meeting point that they discovered, it's a meeting point for us too.
We can think our way into how they're thinking when they're creating it.
Yeah.
No, that's
the hope, I think.
Yeah,
that's the hope.
Indeed. No, that's really powerful. Also, in relation to this, I just wanted to say, sort of with the interaction that you were pointing out with space and this figural art within the space. Since last we were emailing, I've done some quite a lot of space syntax analysis on Persepolis.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's really excitingly actually confirming a lot of what you've been saying about sort of the intentionality of the space in foregrounding these images and bringing people together in order to contemplate these images, because a lot of the places where you have the reliefs on the staircases with all of these sensorial interactions, the staircases of the Apadana, and then in the central building, and in the palaces of Xerxes and Darius, these are the places with the highest visibility really of anywhere in the site. And they're also the places where the flows of people are the flows of people within the site are so constricted, so everyone has to go there. And as you were saying, Margaret Corroot has also said, as you point out, these staircases are specifically designed to make you slow down while you climb them, so that you can stand there and contemplate the sameness that the reliefs bring in. And it really shows that there is there's a larger system at work here, where they're bringing together this space and the figural art on the space in order to inculcate, I guess, these messages in the people there. And it's really exciting.
It is exciting. It's really exciting that you've got this great data, because this is one of the beautiful thing about multiple approaches. When they dovetail like this, it really does start to seem like perhaps that's true. Perhaps it's right that this is what they're doing. Mm-hmm. I can say that it's such a deliberately designed space. And in a lot of ways, I think it's a microcosm for the way that they understand the empire to function. What would it be if you were so careful with all of the details, and if you did bring people together in certain zones deliberately, and if you could show everyone that there is a potential for something more from disparate parts? That's what the site does. And so in a real kind of visceral way, the site is the argument for the utility of this imperial approach. And truly visceral, because as you mentioned, they collude, it's Margaret's word, collude with the body of the visitor so that you actually feel this thing, that you, when you move into certain spaces, things, the scalar references are skewed, or you become an actual participant because of the way you walk up a staircase. And so it basically leverages your body's proprioceptive capacities to join you in. And it's an interesting thing that you don't always well, maybe they do, but we don't always pay attention to proprioception. It's a bad thing when it fails us, but in a normal kind of everyday scope, it's one of those sensorial experiences that's kind of background noise. So I've been interested for some time in the fact that this does seem to be a very interesting thing to deliberately engage the bits of your bodily perceptions that are not necessarily automatic, but that aren't necessarily the kind of thing you focus on. What does it mean when that is what's leveraged? Well, I think what it does is it's kind of a very quiet way of demonstrating inclusion. You are included before you notice you're included. And then when you notice, it's only adding to something that you have felt from the moment that you step foot on the site. And so that is a kind of tantalizing glimpse, maybe, of something that is much bigger.
Definitely. Yes. So two things raising from that. Number one, I wonder if for our listeners, you might be able to define the proprioception term that you've used. Just to, we all know what we're talking about. And then secondly, sort of in relation to this, you write so persuasively and so excitingly about proprioception and about the impact of mirror neurons on the people in the site, and how seeing other people doing things makes those neurons fire and brings you into the picture as well. And you're very careful in the article that mentions them to be like, well, they don't have these terms, obviously, and they're, but they understand how it works. Even if they don't use the same terms that we do, they still understand this process. And I have to say, in my own work, I've often run into this too, both with the tomb towers thing and with the space syntax more broadly, sort of these assumptions that in the ancient world people are backwards in relation to us, and they don't think about things on this level that we do as modern people. And there's sort of this, I think kind of teleological assumption that the people in the past don't get this stuff. We are much cleverer. Do you think we underestimate how much ancient people understand about these processes and how much they use them? Yeah, no, and why do you think that is, if so?
Yeah, we do underestimate them. And I mean, here, I think what we're seeing at Persepolis, at Pompeii, is a set of people who are very careful observers. And they understand other people, the world around them, complex systems through that observation. And I am an archaeologist, which is a type of science, but I'm not a physicist. But I think that is still the starting point. What is science if not very careful observation that is then tested and documented? And they're doing that. That is what Persepolis is. It's a test. They have noticed some things. They have made some observations about how people interact. And they're now going to test those observations by crafting a very carefully controlled environment. And as a result of crafting a very carefully controlled environment, they're going to document, does this have the desired result? So it seems to me that while they're not using scanning electron microscopes, they are working through the same thought processes that are at the heart of the systems that we privilege in our own time. And, there's a bit of proof maybe of such an assertion hanging out over in Ovid. So in the first book of the Metamorphoses, we get a description of the beginning of the world and the beginning of time. And at the start, there are always atoms that are colliding around and banging into each other, and there's chaos. There's usually chaos at the beginning. And what happens after that is that a god comes along and he bounds everything into its appropriate territories so that everything is more or less properly categorized. And they stop having these chaotic collisions. Well, that doesn't sound all that different, does it, from our own narratives about the start of time, the universe, and the beginning of everything? But, they're not launching satellites into outer space to come up with the hit. Instead, you're thinking things through. And sometimes I think that all of our very elaborate systems for thinking things through might get in our way. Maybe they see things a bit more clearly sometimes because it all depends on going back to the basics, going back to saying, what am I looking at and what does it suggest? So at Persepolis, this concept of mirror neurons, the idea that our brains are more or less primed to look for entities that correlate to ourselves, to understand how those entities operate, to see ourselves as correlates to those entities, and then to mimic the way that they act is something that seems to be leveraged. I don't know that you need to know that there's a mirror neuron in play to see that. You might just need to have ever met a child. You might just need to have spent time around the vast number of animals depicted on the site to know that the concept of who, what, which entity can count as something capable of mirroring. Well, I think at Persepolis, certainly they're opening that up. And so if that's a starting point, that you once met a child and they did what you did, or you once were a person who was in a new system and you wanted to include yourself in it, and so you kept your eyes open and you looked around to see what they did, it's a very similar outcome. And that maybe is where they're thinking. It's a bit like being at a very fancy dinner party and kind of glancing at the person next to you to see which fork they start with. Is it a mirror neuron? But is it a mirroring? Yeah, for sure. And so that is something that I think is worthwhile for us to strip back as well. What are our assumptions about ourselves? We tend to think we're very clever, and we are, but they're very clever too. And that there's no reason that they couldn't understand an outcome that's right in front of their face. And there's no reason that you wouldn't leverage that for very complex and interesting ends. And proprioception. So it's difficult to define. Proprioception is more or less the body's awareness of itself in space. One way to understand proprioception is to close your eyes and to touch your fingertips with your thumb. You can't see it. There's no reason that you know it's there, but you do because you understand where your body sits in the larger zone of everything around you. It's one of the reasons that we can walk. We have to be able to understand, where is my foot in relationship to the ground? We practice this as children. You're sort of practicing this skill and you're practicing engaging this sense. It's, children who are learning how to walk fall over a lot. Some of that is because they haven't yet learned their body's relationship to the space around them. So if we can walk without having to stare at our feet, it's because of this sense.
Oh, indeed. And thank you for defining the terms as well. I think that's
it's hard to remember. Yeah, but it's good to do. That's the problem, right? For so long, people didn't define terms, and then we all thought we knew what we were talking about, and it turned out we didn't, nor were we all talking about the same thing.
Precisely. And I think these terms are so useful because they describe things quickly, but as you say, you can get so entangled in jargon that at times, yeah, it becomes confusing, and it is important to cut through that, I think. I was wondering, I really like your description of Persepolis as this experiment. I love that as an idea, and I mean, I completely agree in sort of the ways that it folds you into itself, and sort of, yeah, this total system which is so tightly controlled. And I was wondering, in relation to this, and especially sort of as regards these figural processions and things, obviously we see them most clearly and most in their context at Persepolis, but we also see the staircases in Susa, and then also in brick relief at Susa. We see at both the Shower Palace and at the Apadana Tell, and possibly at the Donjon Tell site, but that's probably Hellenistic, so it's been moved. But I was wondering if you thought, given the general thinking is that Susa is earlier than Persepolis as a system, if you think that there are elements of this experiment running there too, but maybe like an earlier version of the experiment, or
beta test.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. That's such a good way of putting it.
I think it is. I think that we see it a lot, that if we think about the Achaemenids in the run-up to Persepolis as running a series of experiments, I think that it's informative to us. What we see is, here is a group of people, leaders, who would like to be understood differently. That is clear to me from the get-go with them. They don't want to be Neo-Assyrian. They don't want to be Egyptian. They aren't. But at the same time, they've got to speak to all of those groups and more. And they don't want to exclude them, because they understand that it's going to function better if people are working together, at least nominally. And so, yeah, how do you do that? How do you make that work in a zone where images are the currency? Well, it's a big question. And I think that we see hints of it. A hint here, a hint there. Oh, we will see what this looks like in this zone. And I think that the reason that it coalesces at Persepolis is because one of the things that they may figure out at Susa is they need to control the space. At Susa, there's such a long history. And I would say that the Achaemenids are very interested in histories, that they value them and understand them as useful tools. So for my thinking about them, it would be antithetical to their mindset to erase the history at Susa, to rebuild there. That wouldn't make any sense. But so they're constrained there. They have to work within the system that pre-exists them, because that is part of what's valuable about it. And they can add to it, which they do really productively. And I think that's where that is productive. That is something. But if you want to take this a step further and to actually really crystallize this message, you're going to need to be able to crack the space entirely. And I think that is part of the background of the decision to craft Persepolis. And it would make sense. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if they just told us this kind of thing? But I think they do tell us this kind of thing. I think it's there, as you say, in the bricks, in the way in which they're thinking about interactions with space at Susa. What do they add, and where do they add it? Those are the questions, I think, that show us, oh yes, they're going to want to be able to decide where all of the staircases are. And while you can't do that at Susa, you can do that at Persepolis. And so I think that it's not an evolution, it's not a progression, but it is an experiment that shows them that it's worthwhile to take this a step further.
No, definitely. I know I'm saying I agree a lot, but I very much do. And I think in relation to this, you sort of just the way that you get the greater integration of pillar halls in Persepolis, it's so much more fluid than it is at Susa, where you have the sort of Apadana kind of smashed against a slightly more traditional ancient Near Eastern palace with the courtyards and the corridors. Whereas, yeah, as you say, it just the integration of the pillar hall is throughout Persepolis, and it's just, yes, it's not it doesn't feel like there's this opposition almost, which there kind of does with Susa. And in relation to this sort of idea of Susa as a beta test, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the brick versions of the reliefs from Susa, because obviously those brick versions, from what we can tell, there are only 30 bricks at the site that so we're reconstructing a lot from these bricks, but as far as we can tell, in the background, they have this turquoise glaze that eager-eyed listeners will know from the sign of the podcast, because obviously that is from the Susa brick reliefs. But it has this turquoise background to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering, based on your Pompeii article about sort of mirroring, and based on your point about the idea of the stone at Persepolis as this sort of mirrored surface where you see yourself in the reliefs, obviously, but you also see yourself actually mirrored in the stone. And you say in relation to this, the darker stone allows the mirror effect to work, or work better, certainly. And I was wondering, given that the brick version of the reliefs has this turquoise, which is still glazed, but because it's a brighter color, maybe doesn't reflect quite as well. If you think that is again this sort of this beta test at work, where they're like, oh well, this sort of works, this sort of reflects, but then if we get that darker stone color, then that reflects better. I was wondering, do you think that might be a...
It wouldn't shock me. If we were to learn that this were the case, if there were to be some bit of text floating around and it told us this definitively, I would not be shocked. Another thing that I think, it's fascinating about the surface. So with the bricks, in terms of process, I mean, it's very interesting because you've basically got to design a mold for any change you want to make. So, or it has to happen in color, but a lot of the change that we do see, let's say with the archers, is happening in the mold. That you're actually, the distinction between this person has a curl that goes to the left and this person has a curl that goes to the right is so important that it's molded from the start. Okay, so that's a different thought process than the thought processes that you're working with when you're carving the stone, wherein you do have a certain amount of capacity to change in moment. I would not be the one to venture a guess there, but it's possible based on the material. They're getting a lot out of the shift to stone, I would say, at Persepolis. One of the things that is very interesting about the way that the site is constructed, for my money anyways, is the use of crenellations. And the way in which the crenellations on the site mirror the crown of the king, and it all mirrors the mountains that surround the site. And so there's another step here, that the site is the king and the king is the site, and the site is the empire and the king is the empire, and it's all enfolded and entangled with the land itself. And so the switch to stone and the use of a quarry that is not incredibly far from the site actually enables that entanglement. It is the mountain in a way that is kind of fascinating and wonderful. So I think that's part of what they get out of the shift. But together with that, it is the capacity to leverage what stone can do. Stone does a lot of things that skin does. It sweats, it reflects, it is interestingly permeable. And so if an aim is to create any kind of correlation between body and building, stone is useful. Clay is useful as well. Clay has long been one of those correlates for skin. There's the wonderful bit from the Song of Solomon about inscribing someone as a seal on an arm, which does suggest the wonderful connection between clay and skin. But one of the things that stone does is that it's more durable. And Sarah Scott has been doing some interesting work on clay and skin and the idea of pain in clay, that you can harm it. You can kind of, there could be an understanding of a violent interaction there. That is also something that is very carefully obscured at Persepolis, the notion of something like violence. So if there is any connection between clay and violence, that would be another good reason not to make a lot of use of it at Persepolis. But then the reflection question, there's a lot there. So the question of what's going on with the color in the backgrounds at Persepolis is an ongoing one. Alex Nagel has been diligently gathering data on this. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of conflicting data in the systems with which he's working. So Ernst Hertzfeld's notes on the excavation of the site suggests that there is color in the backgrounds and that the color is dark. There are a couple of spaces where he describes something that sounds more or less like black in the background. There's a lot of reasons that might be in terms of what happens to pigments over time and just what he's looking at. And there's a question mark there. And the question mark that I think Alex is seeing is that there is not pigment that is that color when he's looking. And so what is getting described by the excavators is a question mark. One thing that they're clear about is that it shines. When the light hits it, it reflects. So whatever kind of reflective notion is being constructed, that's something that's carrying through when people are encountering it in excavation. In terms of color, blue is a big current question for Alex, and I hesitate to speak on it because I think that it's an ongoing bit of data, but there is color in the backgrounds at Persepolis. I think we can say that definitively. I think it might be blue in some cases. I think that's, it's a distinct thing that's a possibility. And if so, then there's something really interesting happening because, as you say, it is still reflective. It's still giving you this interplay of shadow that integrates person into zone. And it could do that at any time when the sun shines on you in a wall. It doesn't have to be a reflective wall to do that either. So that potential remains open. But if it is something that is in any way a kind of correlate to sky color, correlate to bigger notions of blue in the system, that's great. That would be a kind of amazing thing because so at Persepolis, we know that the site is beautiful and we know because Xerxes tells us. And an ongoing question for me has been, what does that mean? It's a kind of a thing that when you tell people who do lots of work on the Near East, oh, the site is beautiful, you get a sort of shrug because this is often what builders say about the thing they create. But I'm wondering if this might be one of those words that needs definition because it might be a word that we all think we know what we're saying and we don't. So what does beautiful look like to an Achaemenid? I think it must have something to do with light. Beauty and light would make sense to be joined in this mind. So, okay, then we're talking about reflective surfaces. We're talking about things that make light. There is gilding. We know that there's gilding on the site. We know that there are metal attachments. So there are lots of things that are reflecting. And any sheen on the wall, any sheen at all will do the job. It does it with the bricks. It can do it with the wall. Now we're lucky in a sense because we've got these great polished walls that give us an idea of what can be with the stone of the structure.
Sorry, just a question in terms of this beautiful word you're talking about. Is this Old Persian frasha?
I believe so. So yeah, what is it? What does it mean?
Yeah, it is a hard term. It really is a hard term to define, but it really is also one of so much religious significance in the greater Mazdaean tradition. And I think Professor Chaigan in your lecture brought this term up in his question, because the term it is beautiful, it is wondrous, but it's really got this meaning of juicy, of fertility, of growth, and and because in the Mazdaean tradition, the apocalypse, but not really the apocalypse, is the frashokuriety, the juicy making, as Shertho translates it, where the world is made new again in this sort of fertile, blooming way. And I was wondering, sort of in relation to this, if as well as sky, and definitely sky, you thought there was a role for water there, because you have that Padana.
Oh, of course.
Yes, you have the Apadana, the place of waters, and so much. And I got really inspired by this sort of last quarter. There's this new article that's come out about vegetal imagery in the Persepolis reliefs, and trying to work out what all of the plants are. And one of the points that they make in this article, obviously there are plants everywhere in the, and constantly sort of these repeated motifs. But one of the interesting points that they make, and it interacts really interestingly with a point that Kulrut made as well, like the floor of the Apadana as a watery floor, like this reflective floor, but that the pillars in the Apadana, they show lotuses obviously in their art, but that the lotuses on the bottom of the columns are immature lotuses, and then as you go up the column, just before the summit, just before you have these double bullhead capitals, they are mature lotuses. And it's almost as if as you look up the column from the water, the lotus flower is blooming as you follow it up. And yeah, obviously water then has this reflective capability as well. And then the binding together with this frasha thing, where water is so important to frasha as a concept, it definitely sounds like you're onto something there.
It's very interesting, the concept in conjunction with the site, because site's doing something new. Like what is Persepolis? What is the Achaemenid adventure if not a new creation? And so that is an interesting thought. How do we get a new creation? Well, you need light, you need water, you need all of these building blocks. And so this is exactly the payoff for looking carefully at our terms, that we're getting a depth there that we gloss when we just look at the sort of general concept and focus on how long someone's beard is as the answer to it. And well, the question of plants on Persepolis is one that's really been occupying a lot of my thought lately. So one of the things that I think is useful for us to do at Persepolis is just to look at it. We must look at Persepolis and see what it tells us. And for me, what do they give us a lot of? So for people, certainly lions. Lions, they've been a topic for me for a while because of the great number of ways in which they're repeated and how they appear. But plants, just an abundance of plant life. And one of the things that often happens is that when we have an abundance, we kind of maybe as a scholarly body say, okay, it means this, and we slot it in its territory and we move on because we're primed to look for outliers. Okay, so fertility and abundance, that's its category. It lives over there. We understand it, and we can move on to talking about an outlier. Or perhaps the number of ways in which they show plants and the spaces in which they appear and which plants in particular they're showing are all part of an intricate communication, which, as you allude, is the case, I think. But one of the things that's interesting to me about some of the plants has to do with the trees and the Apadana. For me, most things start with the Apadana, just because it's such a rich, rich corpus, and there are so many things that are deliberately juxtaposed there. Big questions, I think, about which tree is which, but one thing that we can say is that if it is a certain type of conifer, it plays very interestingly into Achaemenid notions of gender and difference, because it would be a conifer that in tree terms is male sometimes and female sometimes. And this is the kind of thing that, thinking about what do Achaemenids know? They know this. If you're going to propagate the tree, you have to know how it perpetuates itself. So they're They may call it something else, but they know that its reproductive capacity is different and in different ways at different times. So then it's very interesting to me that you would choose that tree, right? That you go after a both and tree rather than an either or tree, that you're going after both and depictions of lions. And I think maybe both and depictions of people as well, as a part of a system that privileges connection rather than privileges difference. And I think that's maybe a reiteration that we're getting throughout so many of the systems at Persepolis. Connection, connection, connection. Connection in the flow of people, connection between categories, connection between parts of the world. That seems to be a central aim. And what does connect? What connects people? Water. And so I think that this is one of the aspects of the story that is starting to come together. It perhaps would have been much more apparent to people who were more participatory in their system, but we can make the leap too.
Thank you. And that whole idea of the water as a connective medium obviously continues in the Persian garden right up until the sort of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. I mean, I've been reading theoretical works by Iranian scholars on the Persian garden now, and they're like, whether the water is what gives the garden its structure, and the flow, and sort of paralleling the flows of people with the flows of water through the garden. And no, I completely agree. And myself, very big fan of abolishing binary categories, and focusing on connection rather than opposition. So no, very, very, very much a fan of that.
It's what they do at Persepolis. Binary categories aren't useful to them. If you must create a separation, then how could you be a functional integrated empire? And so I don't think that this is certainly not in their best argumentative interest. And it's not what they tell us when they tell us the story of their system at Persepolis.
Definitely. Yes, I also thank you very much for bringing up the question of lions there and because I very much would like for you to talk about sort of your ideas with the Elamite lioness and the presence of the sort of, in quotation marks, of the feminine within the Persepolis reliefs as represented by the Elamite lioness defending her cubs and roaring at them to be quiet in the hands of their handlers, and sort of that complementarity that you describe with the lioness and the other members of these delegations. But yes, could you talk a little bit more about your ideas with this?
So happily. The lioness has, well, I think really for the past year, she's been occupying an outsized place within my brain because she is so interesting and so deliberate. So when we look at the delegations on the Apadana, she is famously the only feminine, female, womanly presence that's overt in any case. This means that she is noteworthy, and she's deliberately noteworthy. You could have had a lion and gotten across the same point about, if the point of including the lioness is to say something about specificity of territory, connections with systems of power and kingship, a lion could have done the job, I would argue. The lioness, as Margaret Full points out, gives you a line of succession, that the succession comes through her. And so that could be something, and I think probably is something, that the lioness does that a lion wouldn't. So for me, the story of the lioness started with the realization that she doesn't look all that different from the lion. When you look at her within the corpus of lions on the site, we get an interesting range. You get fully grown lions with their kind of luxurious manes. You get the cubs on the Apadana. You get these sort of adolescent lions that appear in a few door jams. The king sort of holds them. And well, the king, the hero king, the figure who is definitely an Achaemenid and definitely a powerful one, but may not be particularly aligned with any one individual, that guy holds some lions who are adolescents. Well, that's interesting because we don't see that range of types of entities otherwhere. So not only is the lioness an outlier, but we're getting outliers as lions in multiple ways. So that says lions are important. And when I looked at the lioness, the thing that I noticed just as a viewer was not necessarily her her femininity, it was those teeth. It was that mouth, and it's the fact that the head is turned back. That's interesting. People do turn back in the Apadana. So if we're talking about the kind of lines of waiting courtiers, they are very back and forth. They're very conversational, which is where I think Margaret Fullroot is thinking about the conversation between the lioness and the cubs. But we also get a couple of instances of very occasionally entities turning back and forth in the Apadana, although not in the immediate zone of the lioness. So, okay, this is interesting because this to me, and I think to others, is not necessarily ideal for a lioness, that here is a creature that could 100% kill you. And she is not being so carefully ordered that she lacks agency. So if I were to convey a lioness towards the king, perhaps I would do so in a manner that meant that she could not turn around and leap and kill a person. That was my thought. So what's she doing? I thought, well, that she's participating. She's walking forward of her own volition, because the fact that she's turning means that she could have stopped doing that at any moment. And that was kind of where I began thinking about her and thinking about animals, the extent to which they are also joining in, that this idea of a functional zone breaks down another binary that we have as well, this binary between humans as exceptional animals and the rest of animals. And this, I think, is complicated at Persepolis. You must have all of these other creatures to have a functioning system. If your oxen don't work with you, good luck. If your horses don't work with you, you're not going to get there very quickly, wherever it is you're going. And so the cooperation that is essential for the functioning of an empire extends to all these other personages as well. And when I was looking initially, I was looking for dress. So if these animals are people in the mentality of the system, they should be dressed, because in Persepolis, to be a person is to be dressed. And indeed, many of them are. The coiffing of the horses' manes, the elaboration on the saddles, the ways in which they are wearing things is suggestive, I think, of an extension of a kind of personhood to these other beings. So that was a space that I started thinking in, but I could not let the lioness go because it didn't answer everything about her. And this was a space where I decided it needed to get stripped back. That where did we get all of our ideas about the lioness? Why were we always talking about fertility with the lioness? Was this a woman problem? Was this a problem with us kind of imposing ideas about what women do onto the lioness, who is the only person that we can impose this onto? So I thought, okay, well, maybe. And my question was, if we strip all that away, if we don't think about the lioness as a sort of human with human characteristics, what do we think about her as? That, well, you think about her as a lion and she behaves as a lion does. And certainly I think there's good cause to think that the people who are living in the territory around Persepolis are well versed with what lions do, because there were lions there in the period. So I started thinking, well, if part of what the monument does is talk to people about things they know, this is the sensation of something, this is what it feels to do something as a point of connection, then they're probably pretty aware that people from different territories are bringing different interpretive things to the table as regards lions. This group thinks about lions in one way, this group thinks about lions in another, this group has this lion baggage. So what is the commonality that could be shared between these groups as regards lions? I think it's, what do lions do? How do lions act? What is the behavior of an actual lion? Which led me to a question. What does gender look like to a lion? What are gendered categories if you are a lion actually? How do lions exhibit gendered behavior, if indeed they do? So I started looking at lion behaviors, and well, it was hugely fruitful. So one thing that we can definitively say, I think, is that lions, like house cats, communicate with body language, and their tails are essential to this bodily communication. And if you have a house cat, you are really very familiar with this. You know when the cat's going to pounce, you know when the cat is excited, because you learn what their tails do. And how much must this be heightened if it's a large cat that can kill you? You need to know when the cat is happy. You need to know when the cat is afraid. Otherwise, you will not get out of the way appropriately, and the stakes are very high. So with this in mind, I thought they're probably pretty aware of this. So I read a lot about people who are animal behaviorists who study lions, and as house cats could tell us, their tales are hugely informative. And the tail that the lioness has in the Apadana is a tail that we associate with kind of curious welcoming. It's the tail that a lion has when, a potential friend is about, when they're not threatened, when they're just sort of going about their regular business in a pleasant way. Great. Well, isn't that appropriate for a space like the Apadana? So then I looked at the cubs, who are not showing any kind of defensive behavior. They're very comfortable with the handlers. Like, interesting. So then I moved to the lions. So yeah, not a lot of defensive posturing from them either. Even the ones that are grappling with the king hero figure in the doorways. He's holding a knife, but the lion isn't afraid. The tail is still relaxed. The claws aren't engaged. And if you compare it to similar depictions from the Neo-Assyrian palaces, say like Palace at Khorsabad, this is not the case there. There, the lions are showing signs of aggression and fear. It's like, okay, so this is a group that not only understands lion behavior, but it's deploying it for meaning in the space. Therefore, it felt fair to go back to the question of what does gender look like for lions? And what gender looks like for lions is very different than what gender looks like for humans, at least when we think about normative gender roles for men and for women. So one of the things I became interested in was that there aren't a lot of instances that I'm aware of in the Persian sort of inscription corpus where we're seeing the Achaemenid kings describe themselves as an animal. They are not a lion in the way that other kings are. Because I wonder, what does the king do? The king protects. The king enforces law, the king has logic, the king builds and maintains systems. And interestingly enough, this is what a lioness does. The lioness is the one who enforces the law of the unit. The lioness is the one that protects the unit. The lioness is the one that ensures the unit's continuation by obtaining food and by nurturing the system. The lioness is the one that maintains the integrity of the den. All the things that the king does are the things that a lioness would do. And so then it became very interesting, right? That this is happening in such close proximity to the king and how the king operates. There's maybe a tangent on there about what happens with Asiatic lions who are male lions and cubs that we may be seeing play out in a couple of spaces that would be really interesting for thinking about lines of kingship. That is a growing idea that we'll see if it goes anywhere. But that, I think, is maybe a marker of why it's useful to strip things back, to just start with what do we know basic level? That then maybe complicates our understanding of gender on the site, because definitely the lioness is a lioness. This is made quite clear. But the aspects of the lioness may be aspects that are equally aspects of the king, and that this is maybe part of what the connective system does. That one of the things that I think is difficult for people working in the modern West to confront when we deal with gender is the number of negative associations that are carried with certain gendered ideas. And certainly I think the lioness, and thinking through what lionesses do at Persepolis, says at the very least, it is not a negative thing to be a woman in the Achaemenid system. To say the king is womanly would not be bad. It would not be an insult if the lioness is a sort of marker for how a woman operates. I think that's the very least of what we can say. I think that we may be able to say a great deal more if we continue to pull on these threads, which is, maybe part of also what's getting hinted at by these interestingly gendered trees. What beings are gendered on the Apadana and in Persepolis? How are they gendered? And what does this tell us? Increasingly, I think it tells us we've got to go back to basics and how we understand this system, that what we have imposed on it says much more about scholars in the 18 and 1900s than it does about the people of the Achaemenid system.
Definitely. No, thank you so much for that. And
A long answer. I apologize. I'm excited with the lions, though.
No, they're so endlessly fascinating as elements within these reliefs. And I think what you're saying, sort of with the king acting as a lioness, it really reminds me of a conversation I was having with Professor Dusenberry. Actually, we were talking about humans, of course, but the point that she made in our conversation was, if you look at the textual sources, if you look at the Persepolis Fortification Archive, how do royal women act? They act exactly like men do. They own estates. They go on progresses. They deliver letters. They run up the Kurtash groups. They go with the king. They have their own palaces. They have their own apartments. They have their own land. There really is, as we were saying, there is this complementarity because they are royal first, and they do what royals do. They own this land. They control these people. And again, not to go back to space syntax too much, but the other thing that came forward from the convex and axial analyses, especially the integration analyses that I was running at Persepolis, showed, while the harem area, to use Schmidt's wonderful term, the harem area does have low visibility, obviously, because it's so far away, and it has high step depth because you have to go through a lot of corridors to get there. Again, makes sense. But the harem building and that entire southwest quadrant, but the harem building specifically has, and the southwest quadrant more broadly, has the highest integration, Hillier Hansen integration of anywhere on the terrace. It is the most central to the network of anywhere in the space, more so than the public areas, more so equal to the courtyard around the Apadana in terms of the connectiveness to the rest of the space.
Oh, that's magnificent. That's wonderful.
I think really, to my mind, what that brings home is this complementarity that you see between how a royal man acts and a royal woman acts. They're the same action. It's shown in the spatial logic as well, in that people are far away from the entrance for security and for privacy, but they are at the center of that network, and that is revealed by the spatial logic of the palaces in exactly the same way as it's revealed by the king as lioness in the reliefs itself. So it really it dovetails so beautifully with that idea. So no, thank you for going on the lioness tangent. Yeah, it's so fascinating. No, thank you.
Oh, anytime. It's a favorite topic, really. There's so much there. Exciting about the spatial analysis. It's such a wonderful thing because you have these suspicions, and then it's really beautiful to see how ideas can play out with the application of a methodology that people hadn't really employed to best effect before.
I did just want to. I'm conscious that we have been talking for a while, but I did just want to bring in a question in relation to your very interesting paper about pearls at Pompeii, and sort of the assumptions that we make about the nature of fashion, and whether you can apply the term fashion to the ancient world, because as you say in that article, there is this idea that fashion is a concept is developed in Europe in the 13th century and is, in heavy quotation marks, associated with the modern West and nothing else. And I thought you did a really fascinating and really interesting job of finding the fashion at Pompeii in their use of pearls and how they're applied to dress and the use of materials. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts, given the sort of seemingly timeless nature of Achaemenid reliefs, where the people are individualized, as you say, within this broader system, but the clothing that they wear, at least in form, is sort of unchanging in that way. And I was wondering if there was any way in your mind you could think to find fashion at the Persian court, and the reason that this question sort of rose for me is because in almost every one, and certainly all of the major fictionalized approaches to the Achaemenid court, fashion is so important, and like it's fashion in this sort of modern Western context of change over time, and everyone outdoing one another, and this sort of conspicuous consumption thing. And we see this both in Mary Renault's The Persian Boy, and then also in Gore Vidal's Creation, where Gore Vidal says, yes, it became the fashion in the court to bring in Chinese silk, and then everyone was doing it, and he says this. And then in Persian Boy, Bagoas is searching for a robe to give Alexander, and he describes the Persian court robe as being very old-fashioned, what they're wearing. And I was wondering, can we find fashion in this sense of this change over time at Persepolis? How might we do that? And this is a lot of questions, I'm sorry. And do you think that the high importance of fashion in these sort of modern Western fictionalized approaches to the Achaemenid court, is that just a modern Western imposition, or is it a reflection of, I don't know, a broader truth that has been revealed to them or something? So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
A wonderful and insightful question, because I think that, well, you're an insightful reader of texts, because you very carefully note that I didn't say that there was Persian fashion, because I sidestepped the question, because it is such a loaded one. Okay, so one of the things that is interesting about understanding fashion at Pompeii, if the term is applicable, is that it's materials driven, just like you said, that it's not, so we as sort of modern consumers of fashion are pretty used to a system that's shape driven, particularly around clothing. So what's the hemline doing? Is it a bell bottom? Is it a high waist? That is a marker of fashion. And this is not necessarily the case in zones where shaped clothing is a norm, or where changes in shape happen infrequently. But that's not an indicator that there isn't change. So when we're defining fashion, I tend to define it as time-based change, that it's a change that's happening within a particular bounded time cycle, and that time is really part of what's driving and defining the change as is. There's a lot of question about how fast must the change be. So we're very used to quick rates of change in fashion, and they're only getting quicker when you think about TikTok fashions that are weeks. That's the cycle. So if the cycle is more along the lines of generations, does that still count as fashion, is a sort of open question. But in any case, yeah, that's what we're talking about. So unlike dress, fashion is really broadly defined. Could be anything. You can have a fashion in thought, you can have a fashion in a pet, you can have a fashion in a building. And in that, I think we must see fashion in the Achaemenid system, because there's definitely change in the way in which you're thinking about space and things of that nature. So in that sense, yeah, maybe there is fashion at Persepolis. When we're talking about fashionable bodies, this is where it gets interesting, because my impulse would be to say that it's going to be materials driven. It's going to not necessarily be driven by the shape, but by what you're using as you craft that shape, what you're adding, how you're using the material in question, what amount of one material is there as opposed to another material. What is the embroidery doing? All of those things, I think, would be the spots that we would look for fashion together with. But what are they doing with their hair? What are they doing with their beards? What are they doing with the things that they use to clean themselves with? And this is where it gets a bit tricky, because it's very helpful to have texts that are describing things around the system in this particular attempt to find things. We do have people talking about what Persians are wearing, but as we mentioned a while ago, they're so complicated. One thing that's interesting, I think, that we do get from people like Herodotus or Aeschylus or Xenophon or Pericles is the notion that they understand there to be fashion in Persia. They understand this to be a system that works kind of similarly to theirs, in as much as you use it for conspicuous consumption, that there are ways of creating social hierarchies with it, that there are certain types of material that are associated with this place. That does come through. That's something that they seem to see. And one thing that is interesting there is that for all that we as modern people tend to think about Athenians as standing outside the flow of fashion, they definitely have a fashion for Persian materials. There is a fashion for Persian stuff in Athens, particularly following the Persian Wars. They want it, they buy it. It is such a big deal that it has to get legislated. That is a marker that this is a fashionable thing. And they stop using it after a while, which is another marker of a fashionable thing. So it's a fashion for Persia, certainly. We can see it in other territories that interact with Persia as well. Leticia Rodriguez is doing some interesting work with fashions for Persia in Anatolia, although she doesn't call it that. That's what I would call it, though. Okay, what this suggests is that there's a look. There is a set of materials, that there is a way of wearing that is exportable. This often does correlate to something like a fashion system in the zone that you're exporting from. And I think that what we get when we at least open up the possibility for that is another one of these breaking down of barriers. Because fashion has been so long associated with the West and with newness, and because newness has been so very central to the way in which we define art in the West, there has been a tendency to deny the existence of this in non-Western zones. And to the extent that modern scholars have understood Greece as the West, which is problematic in and of itself, and to the extent to which Persia is then the East, the denial of fashion in one zone while accepting it in another reads to me very much like the perpetuation of the same kinds of dichotomies that are so problematic. So even opening up the potential for fashion in Persia is a meaningful thing. And to know it, we've got to dive into the materials. When are they introducing certain things into the system, if we can know that? And that's what's so hard, because so many of the things we might want to play with there are so very poorly provenanced. But it is a meaningful thing to think through as we attempt to make a space for the Achaemenids that is a space of their own.
Thank you for that. That was, yes, no, an incredible answer. And yeah, no, I guess the other thing we can bring in to some degree is those Susa brick reliefs, because there is one other way that all of those people are differentiated, and clearly probably were differentiated at Persepolis too, with the pigmentation.
Yeah.
The patterns on the clothing, all of them are completely unique. In all of those soldiers have completely different patterns on there.
They do. Yeah. That's where we would look. That is where fashion, I think, would live. Do the patterns change over time? Is this an old pattern when you look at it? That's the question. And that's where the kind of fascinating potential lives. The other thing we might add there is the extent to which Persia has been associated with problematic femininity. You know, the Atossa problem, and well, so has fashion. And so the kind of interest in associating Persia and Achaemenid Persia with fashion in more modern sources might be a kind of other insidious issue. Valerie Steele once called it, it's the F word, fashion and femininity being so closely intertwined and both simultaneously made negative. It's another way of othering Persia. So it's both a pathway forward for Persia and something to be careful with Persia, because of the very many ways that fashion has been understood for us.
Definitely. Thank you.
We'll have a separate conversation about that.
Yes, we should indeed. But yes, no, thank you for that. So,
interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map, or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
We like to end this podcast with two sort of summing up questions that leave us with things to think about for the next few episodes, and different perspectives on the same questions from different people. So the first of these questions: what is the greatest legacy of ancient Persia?
Oh, wow.
Big question.
For me, I think the greatest legacy of ancient Persia is this potential. So what does it look like with an imperial system that doesn't craft a message based upon violence, based upon subjugation, that uses fear and death as the way in which to create the potential for function. What if there is another option? What if this is more, or could be for us, more than a kind of ideal? What does it look like where you have a system that recognizes and celebrates difference while understanding these differences as a strength that can build a greater whole? I think that that has such potential and would be such a wonderful thing to be the legacy of Persia for us now.
That's really beautiful. And a really
Their idea.
Yeah, well, indeed. No, this gate of all nations, this land of peoples of many kinds, and all kinds.
Oh.
Yes. So the other aspect of legacy is, of course, what we leave as scholars and what we can bring to future generations. So what do you think is the best legacy that we could leave for scholars of the future in this field with the work that we do at the moment?
I think that maybe what we can do is strip it back. Maybe this is our moment where we're living in a period where we understand complexity, where we see it, where there's such a vast interconnectedness through very many means that we are made aware of potential indifference. And this seems to be central to Persia. And so what if we're in a moment where, first off, we can understand what they're saying because we're in one of those interconnected zones? And what if the fact that we're in that zone means that we're uniquely capable of stripping away all of those layers of complication that made it difficult for us to see what they might be saying? So that is what I hope we can do. I hope that we can excavate out all of those past ideas and recognize them and save them, but put them to the side as we go back to maybe what's the very basic at a site like Persepolis and just look at the thing. Let's just maybe look at the thing and see if that's a good starting place. So maybe what we offer to the future is a clean slate.
I liked that a lot. In relation to this, and thank you so much again for coming on the podcast and for such a really fascinating dive into Persepolis as a site and gender and fashion and all of these really fascinating topics. I was wondering at this point in the show, we'd like to ask if there's anywhere people can read any of your articles, or places if they want to reach out to you, and we will obviously link this down below the podcast. But yes, so this would be the place for that if there's anywhere you'd like to promote, I guess, in relation to that, if they'd like to read more.
Well, if you'd like to read more about pearls in Pompeii, please seek out the journal Fashion Studies, which is an open access journal. Type in my name, Fashion Studies, and it should take you directly to Pompey's Pearls. If you want to hear more about dress at Persepolis, there are a number of options, including the wonderful volume, What Shall I Say of Clothes, which was edited by Megan Cifarelli and Laura Galinsky, that appeared as part of the special papers in ancient art and architecture as published by the AIA, together with Fashion Selves, which is another Megan Cifarelli edited volume. If you're interested in proprioception, please do see the Handbook of Senses in the Ancient Near East, which offers you a wonderful overview of many, many senses, including the work on proprioception that Charlotte and I mentioned here. And stay tuned for future offerings. If you want to talk in general, please do email me directly. My email is my name, neville.mcferrin@unt.edu. And I would be so very excited to hear anything at all about what's going on your side of things, people of the world, as regards the Achaemenid Empire.
Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating, and thank you for coming again.
Thank you. This was wonderful. It was such a joy and so exciting to have the opportunity to just talk about Achaemenids.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Purdue Institute and at Purdue UCLA, or visit our website, purdue.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Purdue Institute, please email us at purduepodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.